Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Here with Dan. Dan, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Hi, I'm Dan Kaszeta. I've got 31, almost 32 years now experience in, well, I call it defense against the dark arts, uh, but protecting and defending against chemical, biological, radiological threats. And I'd say most of my career had been on the chemical and biological side. I did a little bit of radiological nuclear stuff. Uh, and I've had an interesting career in wherein I've passed through a lot of different places. I started out in the U.S. Army, ended up working in the Pentagon, ended up working in the White House military office, ended up going down the street from the White House to the U.S. Secret Service. And 14 years ago, I moved to London, where, after a brief spell in industry, like in the actual defense industry, doing product development and sales in chemical warfare detection. Since about 2011 now, I've been a author, consultant, uh, part-time this and that to make the bills, but generally speaking, trying to be the guy now issuing wisdom instead of just going out and running around in a gas mask and a suit. Anyway, I'm not sure that's the best introduction, but we could dig into any of that when you get through it. Get through to it.
This is probably going to take us a little bit in a different direction than you probably would
By all
think.
means.
But when it comes to chemical warfare, are you surprised or are you just fascinated by it as much as I am? Like, I get war and I know how dirty war can get, but just like the way that we use methods and we look at anything that we discover and we try and find a way to either, hey, what's the weapon capabilities of this? I mean, it's not just an American thing, it's a world thing about like what we do when it comes to battle.
Okay. Uh, I've been through a huge sort of weird learning curve. I've been through that whole Dunning-Kruger thing where I thought I was a genius early on and I wasn't. And then a long, slow building curve, building up my knowledge over many, many, many years and having actually attacked the issue of chemical warfare from a lot of different angles. Uh, and my take is a little bit controversial. My take is one of the it's greatly overrated. All right, one of the reasons why we don't see it more often is it's a category of warfare that has largely failed to live up to the claims of its proponents. The people who are most strongly the partisans for it, the people who are most strongly advocating for development and use of chemical weapons, largely things did not work out as well or as cheaply or as effectively as any of these people ever wanted to. Okay, and so it's a category of warfare, it's a category of weapon that figures larger in people's psyche than it does in an actual practical historical record. Uh, and that gets into things like, well, why is it banned? Well, I'll give you a dirty little secret. One of the reasons why it's one of the oldest forms of warfare to be banned, it was also one of the easiest forms of warfare to be given up in the 1920s at a point at which people are seriously talking about arms control almost for the first time. It was one of these categories of warfare. It was a technical development from the First World War that, if you look at it that way, it sits alongside of things like submarines, machine guns, airplanes, tanks, landmines, torpedoes, barbed wire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Zeppelin, well, with the possible exception of Zeppelins didn't work out too well either. It's one of those things that just didn't quite show the promise at the end of the war. Those other things did. Nobody sat down to ban submarines. Okay, nobody sat down to ban airplanes. Nobody sat down to ban tanks. But in the 1920s, in diplomacy, chemical weapons are a relatively easy poker chip to give up. All right. And nobody really gave them up. What happened was this thing called the Geneva Protocol, where basically everybody renounced first use of chemical weapons. All right. People were, countries were allowed to amass and develop chemical weapons, but the prohibition was against first use, and then you were allowed to retaliate in kind. Uh, and that actually goes down as a fairly interesting, mostly successful bit of arms control.
Did they give it up because like it was seen as like, oh, I'll give this up, not for an action of like, oh, it's going to be good for humanity, but an action is like it's just too much work to try and develop this even farther?
Well, the thing is, I'm old, but I'm not that old, so I wasn't a fly on the wall in the room. Uh, I mean, what you have to understand is governments, ministries of defense, generals, even by the 1920s, these guys are all governing by spreadsheet. All right. And people can look at how much money did we spend on this stuff? We spent a lot of money. Okay. We spent a lot of money on countermeasures to this stuff. Did we win any battles? And general is asking the colonels and majors, hey, what battle did we win with this stuff? And everybody's sort of looking around the room, scratching their heads. um, and some lieutenant somewhere says, well, actually, we lost a battle because the wind shifted and we got our own guys. Oh, so, okay. And the First World War, because this was a war of spreadsheets, it really was. It's this war that was fought by centralized bureaucracies and ministries of defense who did things like, keep records and pay bills and pay war pensions afterwards to people who had been wounded. And there's a lot of box ticking that went on. Okay. And so we got box ticking on cause of death. All right. Those records are better in some armies than others. They're a bit speculative in the Russian army. You'll be no surprise. For you to hear those records are extremely good in the German army, very good in the U.S. Army, very good in the British Army, pretty good in the French Army. And so we can look at, how many people died of chemical warfare versus other things, and it's really a drop in the bucket. Okay, more German soldiers died from cavalry sabers than from poisonous gas in that First World War. And we think of cavalry sabers, that's old technology, but it is. But more people died from that than from chemical warfare. All right.
I'm pretty sure when we did the chemical warfare against the Germans, they just put on gas masks, didn't they? That's why there's a bunch of photos of them just wearing gas masks.
Yes. Well, that's the thing. That's the thing. The great bulk of the fatalities from chemical warfare in the First World War were in the Russian army and the Italian army. The Italian army had under-resourced chemical warfare defense because it was largely fighting against the Austrians. The Austrians weren't using it, and then all of a sudden the Austrians started using it, and the gas masks that they had been using were pretty deficient, and not everybody had them. And the Russians were horribly under-equipped. So huge amounts of the actual fatalities were Russians and Italians, not Germans, French, Americans, Brits or Canadians or all. So what you have is it's actually a category of warfare that is easy to negate. In a way, it's far easier to negate that than it is to negate, bullets. Okay. Because what you're effectively doing is you're creating a battlefield operating condition. Okay. Not dissimilar to, say, tropical disease, heat, humidity, cold weather, something like that. You're creating an operating condition for which there is clothing and equipment and training that you can give to your soldiers to remediate that risk. Okay. It's much harder. It's getting better to do it against things like blast and fragmentation and gunshot injuries and all that with more advanced body armor. But that's been a much longer, slower development. So where does that leave chemical weapons? And where it leaves it as a category of warfare that actually hurts civilians more than it hurts the military, because the military can rather easily train and protect itself against it. So this gets into one of the other reasons why it was banned, because it was banned as something being disproportionate. It might have a bit of use in the battlefield, but that use is outweighed by risks to non-combatants. So that was a huge consideration.
Well, I'm about to say, even if we talk about like biological warfare, I mean, it does sound good on paper but when you get down to the basic aspect of implementing into war, it's kind of like going swimming, but instead of bringing your swim trunks, you bring a snowsuit. Like it's it's just, I mean, you got to look at like it's good in a small, I guess, spot. Like if you're in a building and there was like a gas leak, if there was a chemical leak, then that would be an issue. But we have ventilation systems to be able to protect that. But if you look at a battlefield and you're going to spray something, you got open air and then all this exposure that goes out, it necessarily doesn't really do what you want it to do.
Okay, okay. So you've hit on something very, very critical here. And this is one of the points where I was on that learning curve, and I had a huge epiphany about chemical warfare. I started looking at things like target analysis manuals left over from the Cold War, and these things called chemical ammunition expenditure tables, which is literally how many artillery shells per grid square do you need to achieve this particular uh, tactical effect. And then there's lots of different calculations to go into, which table to use under which conditions, and all these flow charts and these weird nomographs. This is all pre-calculator era, basically stuff. This is all from the 40s and 50s. But you work through all this, and it's a stunning realization. Okay, if every variable works up right on a particular spot on a particular battlefield under the right conditions, yeah, chemical weapons can be very effective. All right, but only if all those variables line up. So if you were to look at the classic theoretical Cold War conflict that didn't happen, is sort of a Soviet invasion of Central Europe, the classic Fulda Gap scenario. The Russians are coming over the border. The Eighth Guard Tank Army is bearing down on the American Fifth Corps. They're fighting, sliming each other, all that. Okay, now you look at, say, Central Europe, your weather conditions, terrain, all that sort of stuff, all these variables. Maybe, and you took you took and then you take a big wall chart. And now imagine, all right, so imagine you got this wall chart, and it's a calendar, and you got a little box for every day out of the year. So there's 365 boxes on the wall. And in each one of those boxes, you got a 1 hour window, for each hour. So you got 24 boxes inside. So that's a shit ton of boxes.
Yeah.
Okay, so you take a look at an average spot on the map. You can take a look and say you could do this as a number crunching exercise. It's probably actually pretty easy to do now. 50 years ago, it would take it a bunch of interns and a lot of grunt work, but you could do it. I would say, so for this spot on the map, this grid square in the Fulda Gap. All right, okay, all you staff officers and guys out there, I want you to put with a green pen, fill a green highlighter, green, on every 1 hour block that historically over the last year, because we had a weather station in that grid square, okay, where the conditions were such that chemical warfare was going to be really highly effective, more highly effective than conventional weapons. All right, and you would have some spots of green, mostly in the small hours of the morning, mostly in the summer, a little bit in the late spring, early autumn. Okay, you'd have some green, but it'd be like maybe less than 10% of the white space on the map. Okay, and say, all right, take a yellow pen, and we're going to put in yellow in every little 1 hour slot where it's just as good as conventional weapons, no better, no worse, roughly the same. And by the same, I mean the same amount of chemical artillery shells to fire for the same effect as the equivalent of conventional artillery shells. Okay, so you get maybe 15-20%, it's yellow. What does that mean? The rest of the map, the rest of that time is red. Now, what kind of bean counter, what kind of Pentagon office wants to spend a lot of money on something that is only useful 10% of the time in the place where you need it most?
Well, see, that's the thing, is that we had this idea that we could incapacitate our enemies, but it turns out that it really didn't do that at all. It really kind of just, I mean, they found a way to either put like gas masks on or something to get over it, or you had like walking zombies where you had people that were like, delirious and still going out into battle.
Well, yeah, you're probably talking about the whole BZ experience, yeah. Well, and the thing is, so an awful lot of effort went into something that was really only good maybe 10% of the time, and then you get into other environments and other climates, mostly that 10% starts to shrink instead of get larger. Okay. So yeah, you could calculate and argue that yeah, there's a niche. There's a niche right here, and this niche, it's a really really good weapon. But for a guy that has to produce weapons and keep an arsenal of stuff and all that, and have a supply chain to supply those shells to that artillery crew, and that artillery crew has to put the right fuse on it, fire it downrange. That's an awful lot of work for only part of the time. Whereas a general and a colonel and a company commander, all these guys want stuff that will work day, night, rain, shine, snow, hot weather, cold weather. They want all weather capability. And chemical warfare will never give you that. Your conventional lethality pretty much will. Now, you start combining this with a couple other things. In the 1960s, at least in the U.S. Army, the conventional artillery fire, and I mention this because the absolute bulk of chemical weapons in the U.S. system were artillery shells. Okay, they were the workhorse of this, not aerial bombs, because the Air Force and the Navy didn't quite embrace the whole concept the same way as the Army did, and so the ability of the accuracy, the rate of fire, and the lethality, the reliability of conventional ammunition and conventional artillery fires became gradually, not revolutionary, but gradually over a sort of a period, somewhere starting in the 1950s, progressing through the 1980s, when you started to use things like actual computers to do your calculation, a big shift to self-propelled versus towed artillery, which had the effect of an artillery battalion could shoot, move, shoot, move, shoot, move, and their setup time was a lot faster. So a particular artillery battalion or artillery battery, in a course of an hour or a day, could put a lot more steel downrange. And so all of a sudden, somebody somewhere in the Army looked at this and said, this chemical warfare stuff is basically a waste of our time. And so there was a point at which, somewhere in American doctrine, it was unofficial at some point in the mid 60s. It became official with Nixon basically taking the program and largely shoving it into the freezer in 1969, where it switched from an actual warfighting capability to largely a political bargaining chip and basically, a retaliatory thing. We have this to keep the Russians from using it. So it's here to retaliate. It's not something that, seriously, we're paying it lip service.
Well, it's rare when you see it happen. I think the only account I can honestly think of is when sarin was used in like 1995. I think it was in Japan. There was like 4 people that.
Well, yeah. The Japanese cult. You had. I mean, the Iran-Iraq War has got some interesting classical examples of chemical warfare. It does, and that's. I mean, I'm almost going to say it's the exception to prove the rule. You can take a look at the historical uses of chemical warfare, and they're not that many. They are the big ones that come to mind are
Nazis.
and not really, no,
Oh, really?
because their instances of battlefield chemical warfare use are basically almost zero. Because you think so we got to disaggregate the horrible use of basically industrial chemicals in the death camps, okay, versus battlefield use. Now, so we're looking at actual battlefield use of chemical warfare. Mussolini against the Ethiopians, yes, okay, and some of that, believe it or not, was for political reasons. Because if you look at the rhetoric at the time, they were literally referring to their Ethiopian enemies as pests, vermin, insects. And so there's this whole weird fumigation pesticide theme going on in the discourse of the time. Okay. That, and honestly, they were invading a much more populous country with a technically advanced but much smaller military. And it did take them 6 or 9 months to take over Ethiopia. They did use chemical weapons. They used phosgene. They used mustard gas. Okay. Then in the Second World War, the only major example of chemical warfare, barring a few isolated incidents, is actually on the Japan-China front. Okay. It's it's not as well documented in English language as it ought to be, and I really want to do more research on it. I'm a bit crippled because the source materials there are all in Japanese and Chinese. Um, but there was a lot of use by the Japanese against the Chinese. There was a very tiny, tiny, limited attempt by the Chinese to retaliate in kind. Uh, but so what you get in this scenario, in both the Ethiopia and the China-Japan front, is you get somebody who is using it without fear of retaliation in kind, okay? And using it as a perceived force multiplier against a numerically superior enemy, okay? And then you get it in the Iran-Iraq war for precisely the same reason. The Iranian army is larger, but less well equipped than the Iraqi army. So Saddam uses it to some effect early on. That effect diminishes over time as the Iranian army basically relearns lessons it had learned years ago, because it had a whole cadre of officers who had gone to classical American training. You know, they basically reopened the old manuals and, all right, we're not going to have these concentrations of troops here. We're going to spread people out. We're going to start fielding atropine as an antidote. We're going to start taking decontamination seriously again. We're going to start buying and making gas masks, stuff like that. So the effectiveness against the Iranian army, went down over the course of a couple of years. But there are a few classic examples of actual sort of Soviet type military chemical warfare doctrine being successfully used by the Iraqis in that war, because the Iraqis had all been trained in the sort of Soviet style. And it's you know it's an example. Then we have basically a one-off in Tokyo. A lesser known example in Tokyo, a year earlier in a place called Matsumoto by the same group. It wasn't known as sarin at the time and didn't get the world press on it. And we get this war in Syria. Again, the war in Syria, it's a disproportionate conflict. The Syrian take on the whole thing is effectively they're using it as part of a broad spectrum, and largely not nerve agents. There've been a couple nerve agent attacks, largely chlorine, as part of a broad spectrum, what they would call a draining the sea approach. It's that you have to view these attacks not in their isolation. You have to view them as really alongside bombing bakeries and bombing hospitals and bombing marketplaces, sabotaging water supplies, all of which is going on. Things to make life as miserable as possible in areas that aren't under regime control, to get people to flee. Okay, so again, there's a disproportion there.
Well, do you see the elevation go from when it gets out of battlefield and starts heading more? Because I always look at, like, they say they denounce it, or let's ring this up for battlefield purposes, because they don't see any weight in it doing more than what it does when it comes to just normal weapon capabilities. But then you start looking at like covert operations and things of those sort, and like precise attacks, I would say.
Oh, yeah. Well, so if you start getting into if you start getting out of the warfare world, okay, and into assassination, okay, assassination and terrorist attacks. Okay, small, more targeted effect. You get an interest. You get a variant of the same calculus, in that the acquisition cost in terms of acquiring capability to do it, in terms of time, money, equipment, resources, specialist labor, um, is pretty high in chemicals, when you can compare to bombs and guns, which all these extremist groups, they kind of already know. So it's not that if yeah, it takes time and money to learn how to build bombs from scratch, but that expertise, that time, money, and effort has already been spent in most cases with extremist groups. Okay, so if you're just trying to kill people, bombs and guns are a tried and true method that are cheaper and more reliable. So that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen more terrorism now in this regard, because even the crazy terrorist groups, they've got spreadsheets and budgets and all that. Okay, they want to spend money on stuff, but hey, a couple guys with AK-47s is cheap. Kitting out a lab to make a gallon of sarin is not cheap. Okay, and it's also fraught with more opportunities to screw up and be discovered because the neighbors don't like the smell. That's literally what rumbled the. That's literally what precipitated the Tokyo sarin attack was that the neighbors were tired of the noxious smells from their cult compound, and the police were about to raid the place. so, um, so you get that. Now, that's not saying that there isn't somebody who's going to be hell bent on it for its own purposes. Okay. Again, that's part of the stuff in the Japan situation. It's you know when you get to a idiosyncratic religious group like the Alm cult, their leader had funny ideas. Okay, and one of his funny ideas was that chemical weapons were the shit. Okay, so yeah, okay, so he had a bias towards it, and the irony is the same amount of attackers with, say, pistols and submachine guns could have killed way more people in that subway system than they did with sarin, and for a fraction of the cost.
Well, I think like I definitely when I say sending a message, I think what I mean by that is like it's just weird to see. Like when you see like something poisonous gas goes off and kills this many, you're like, that's fucking strange to see in the news. And you start realizing that it's like it's to send a message to not only that, but it's just a rare occurrence where if you ask the general public about like a terrorist attack, people would definitely say bombs, but also we've been briefed on bioweapons, we've been briefed on chemical weapons before, not just through our history books, but also through these personal attacks where you go, it might cost more to do something like that. But that's kind of the point of their idea is that we're going to do it this way.
Yeah, and I don't know where some of that's a feedback loop. Some of it's a psychological feedback loop in that we're really afraid about this. Well, why are we afraid about it? Well, because it's really bad. Well, why is it really bad? Because it makes people afraid. Oh, okay,
Well,
okay,
nobody
that's
knows what the
yeah.
hell it is. You ask somebody about a
Yeah,
sarin leak, and they're like, "What? What do I got? Do I wear a mask?" It's like, well, here's the thing: is when we rang it up, we could be in a whole different world if they would have just held out and did more research and more focus. They could have maybe found a way to get it, but we gave it up so early, and then now we're so far ahead that when we do see it, it's like there's not even a point in using it because it has to be in a contained spot. But also, we have antidotes for most of the shit.
yeah, exactly. And I really, really got into it. I mean, one of the reasons we're talking here is, Sergei Skripal got poisoned. Okay.
Who?
Sergei Skripal, the Russian defector, got poisoned with Novichok here in the UK
That was in 2013.
in 2018. Yeah.
2018. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. He and his daughter got poisoned. They didn't die. The weird conspiracy netherworld commentary that spun off of that is just yeah uh, an interesting phenomenon, so interesting I'm actually writing a book chapter on it, on the disinformation aspects of that whole thing. um
What is the disinformation aspect?
well, because within days, Russian state media, either directly or through sort of their own, really closely affiliated proxies, were really shoving a lot of uh, conspiracy theories, alternative explanations, um, strange ideas, ranging from the completely ridiculous to the, I suppose is plausible. And I stopped counting at about 40. It's like 40 different stories, guys. This can't all be true.
From what I've heard, I just want to make sure this isn't a conspiracy, but from what I've heard, the UK and a lot of people think that it wasn't attacked from like it was a Russian thing. It wasn't anything but that. But is that a conspiracy?
Well, no, no. So the Russians very clearly did it. I mean,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, we got these two GRU guys on CCTV camera walking out of the train station, okay, in Salisbury, and going the wrong way from the cathedral that they allegedly went to visit, heading off in the direction. Because doing research for my book, I ended up walking the pathway, and then this exotic form of Novichok nerve agent ends up precisely on the door handle of this guy's house. Okay. Precisely on the day that these two GRU guys, who, oh, by the way, had been there the previous day.
Coincidence.
Yeah,
Coincidence.
yeah, oh, yeah. The same two guys wanted in the Czech Republic for, an arms depot blowing up.
Oh God.
Yeah, yeah, no, so it's, all that. So it's a pretty clear case. And it's a case of this really is the method being the message. Okay. Back to what you were saying, sending a message. This is a message. The message is Moscow did it. Yeah, we're going to throw a bunch of bullshit at you because we know you got a bunch of, tinfoil hat wearing guys who repeat any old bullshit. Blame the Freemasons, blame Mossad, blame the CIA, blame MI6, blame, anybody else, blame the Czechs, blame the Swedes. I mean, they blame the Swedes. I mean,
Well, it's like whenever you see something like bubonic plague or something like that, like now in today's time, you're just like, what the like, don't we have like a way to fix, like, to make sure that doesn't kill anybody? And you're like, yeah, we do, but that's a message. That's not necessarily someone trying to kill a bunch of
oh,
people.
yeah. So Sergei Skripal was in his 60s, allegedly diabetic, drank like a fish, smoked like a chimney, probably didn't eat the most healthy diet. We don't have any great, idea that he took a lot of physical exercise. So this is a guy who just fell over dead on his couch.
What about his daughter?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So I think that's part of the message. Two people getting sick with the exact same thing. That's not somebody. That's not some guy just having a heart attack. So if the if the Russian security services wanted him dead, there's a lot of ways to have him dead, or he could just disappear without a trace.
Or a car
Okay,
crash
car crash, get stabbed in a robbery gone bad. Trip and fall.
down the
You know,
stairs,
exactly. These things happen.
met up with Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, he fell up the stairs. I mean, that happens in prisons. Seemingly only happens in British police stations. Oh, he fell up the stairs. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of things that could have happened. So instead of plausible deniability, we have implausible deniability. And so it makes you wonder whether or not Sergei Skripal actually died. I don't even think that's the point. The point is scaring other people off of defecting and deserting, because Putin personally dislikes disloyalty and traitors. Nobody likes them, but he has got a real grief with that, ensuring that Russians running around here living their life in the UK behave themselves according to his idea, because we got a lot of Russians here, and a lot of those Russians don't like Putin. They're here because they took themselves and their money away from him. Okay, and so something to just put the fear of retribution into Russians living in the UK. Okay, now fat old guy smoking falling over dead in a heart attack isn't going to do that. Exotic poison with a Russian name on it. It's just like Litvinenko in 2006 was murdered with polonium that could only have been made in one spot in the former Soviet Union. I mean,
Hold on.
yeah.
Is Russia the one that still uses these types of methods the most? Because, like, I mean, I've been having a JFK fascination, so I've been going into our archives, and if you look at like, well,
There's
if you
a
look at
whole history. There's a whole history of Russian security service poisonings going all the way back to the 1920s. It's a long history.
Well,
Okay.
I think you just answered a question for me, which was the aspect of, like, when I was looking at the Cuban Castro assassination attempts, they had poisoned cigars, they had heart attack in his favorite coffee or something like that. But then when the assassination attempts, when a lot of that information was released or Castro made a public message about it, it was to make the Cubans turn on Castro, not only that they weren't already turning, but lose faith in that how strong he was of a powerful force. But when they asked I think his name was Khrushchev back then.
Khrushchev, yeah.
Yeah, when they asked him about, are you afraid of this? Like, maybe there's plans for you on this aspect of things. Yeah, I'm not worried about that. And I go, you wouldn't be worried if your whole entire organization was researching that shit anyway. You probably have an antidote for most of it.
Yeah. Well, but also, I mean, you get down to the point of, in a lot of ways, actually, the older methods of shooting and stabbing and car crashes are statistically more reliable. Okay.
So it's one and done.
Yeah. So, a lot of the tinfoil hat conspiracy theory stuff about Sergei Skripal's assassination really boiled down to, oh my God, he survived. It must not have been the deadly nerve agent after all. It's like, no. nerve agent poisoning, regardless if it's a really exotic one or basically an organophosphate pesticide, it causes the same problem medically. Okay. And it's a medically treatable condition if you can help somebody fast enough. And, you know, if Sergei Skripal had been basically stayed at home, he might have died a quiet death on his sofa and his daughter. And he'd only found about it days later when the neighbors start complaining about the smell. Okay. Um, but they went out. They went out to have a nice day out. Okay. They went out and ate pizza, then they went to the pub, and then they got sick on a park bench in public where people could help them. Okay. And that's what saved their life, you know. So, you know,
Well, you got to look at the examination of how many people go to the doctor when they start feeling bad, or how many people go, "I'm going to sleep it off." So, I mean, that bases its effectiveness.
well, not only that, nerve agent exposure causes cognitive problems.
That's a big fear for a lot of people.
Well, in the immediate term, it muddles your thinking. Okay, so you know, because I wrote a whole book on the history of nerve agents, and I did stuff like, you know what? Why has nobody ever talked to somebody who's been poisoned with a nerve agent? Talk to them about this stuff. What's it feel like? By that I say nobody's really done it in the English speaking world. It's been done in Japan. Okay, this guy Murakami did a whole book interviewing people who had been exposed in the Tokyo subway.
Okay.
Okay, and huge amount of information there. Okay, and to be honest, because that is a defined cohort. There's only so many people who are on the subway that time, and people went mostly got medical assistance. Some people went home and sleep it off and reported it later. It's a cohort that can be studied. Okay, you know, and has been studied. People who were in the Iraqi army or the Iranian army or in these Kurdish villages bombed by Kurdish villages bombed by the Iraqis. That's more anecdotal and there's less systematic study of that stuff. It's not that there's no study of it. It's just it's been a harder demographic to to access. It's been very easy for academics in Japan studying this to look at that experience. Okay, and there's also a couple of people in the U.S. who were not heavily exposed and got a bit ill off of old Iraqi munitions in sort of the early 2000s, right after in the few years after we invaded Iraq. And so I found one of these guys, Michael Yandell, uh, and I interviewed him at length on, dude, tell me your story. What did it feel like? Okay. Now, if you talk to both him and you read this Murakami book, a couple things come up. You get sort of confusion and lack of chronology. Okay. People get events a little bit muddled up. There are people who there are people who basically got to the office in Japan, and the coworker says, "Oh, you look really messed up. You should go see a doctor." And they literally couldn't remember how they got to the office. Okay. Um, this guy Yandell talks about basically him and his colleague, whose name escapes me off the top of it. There are two of them, two Army EOD guys. They're in the front of an armored Humvee, and they were basically losing the plot. They got very confused, and the only reason why they got back to base is they're in the middle of a convoy, so all they got to do is follow the vehicle in front of them, and they just really couldn't understand what each other was saying, and they were just babbling, and so yeah, we've not had Sergei Skripal's account of what happened that day, and it's quite possible he doesn't have one. Okay, uh, because some people in Tokyo are just a complete blank. Some people can only remember snippets. Some people, like I said, have this sort of weird chronological confusion because nerve agents, by definition, mess with your nervous system. Okay, they mess with the chemistry of your nervous system. Most of your nervous system's in your brain, and we only have a limited idea of how it really affects your cognitive functions.
That's what they did in the interview. They went to handshake Kim Jong, and they had the tablet, the ricin strip that was going to make him crap himself.
Yeah, Well, so you've got this whole idea. Nerve agents held a particular niche in that the victim might not be able to assist his own defense, assist the investigation. Okay, because you could question him and say, "What the hell happened? Where did you go? What did you do?" Don't you know?
Yeah.
But also, it's associated with your longer term effects are associated with things like anxiety, depression, insomnia, hallucinatory nightmares. Some people fear that sort of stuff more than a bullet in the head.
Yeah, well, that's like prolonged torture is why I said like
Yeah,
the methods changed. They didn't really need it to kill people on the battlefield anymore. Now they could use it for more covert stuff. I mean, if you can make a person slowly go, and this is interesting that you wrote about that because what I find fascinating when I look through like CIA stuff is their usage of LSD. And people go like, why are they using mind altering drugs? I was like, think of that though. Like mind altering the way that you hear it from like movies and stuff is like, oh, I had a fun trip. But imagine if you can turn it up even more and make it bad where you talk about mind altering in the worst possible way where you make someone scare I mean just be afraid to walk around.
yeah. Well, and the, anecdotally, the and this is it's urban legend, but I think it's an urban legend that's probably true. Uh, is that all right? The U.S. had basically two factories for making nerve agents. Uh, it had Rocky Mountain Arsenal, which made sarin from about 1955 to about 1959. No, or no, sorry, 1953 to about 1957. All right, and this place called Newport Army Chemical Plant in Indiana, which made VX. Now, in the mid to late 60s, off the top of my head, say about 62 to about 68. But again, I'm going on memory on that.
And Vigo Ordnance Plant, don't forget that one.
What's that?
Vigo Ordnance Plant, we were hired by the UK government to make anthrax bombs.
Oh, the anthrax. Yeah, I was specifically talking the nerve agents because we get into I'm going to make an occupational safety and health point. It was rumored that basically these guys working in the plants, they were never just quite right mentally.
Like
Okay.
drank too much bathwater or something.
Well, low grade exposure to nerve agents over a long period of time, even some very, very low grade exposure, did it mess these people up? And we've got instances looking at the very first nerve agent factory that the Germans made in a place called Deinhardfurth. Um, we've got we've got instances of staff suicide there, you know, but also there's interesting statistical correlations here in Britain with the use of organophosphate sheep dips and rural suicide rates. Farmers killing themselves after chronic depression. And these guys are using pesticides that are now banned. They all happen to be in this organophosphate category. Well, organophosphates are nerve agents. Okay. Some just happen to be better at killing people than insects, and some are better at killing insects than people.
Well, that's Roundup. Issue why people have a lot of problems with Monsanto's. I mean, Monsanto's this spray used on your crops and stuff happens
Well,
to
yeah,
be
yeah,
it's a very
yeah, and
toxic chemical.
it's that one that's out of that particular thing is out of my zone of expertise because it's not a nerve agent. But yeah, but things like, but there are chlorpyrifos is one. Parathine was a bad one in the 1950s and 60s, still used in India. And you get cases of psychosis and chronic depression still in India, where farmers are using old and off-label insecticides or not diluting them properly. So yeah, so you start these things adding up. So it's a category of weapons with a category of chemicals with long-term neuropsychiatric effects that aren't well understood. Okay, uh, uh, and so maybe is it possible that the Soviet Union did far less ethical studies on this stuff and has far more data on how badly this messes people up? I'm gonna venture guess to say they probably do. Um,
I'm sure we all do though.
yeah, well, to be honest, having seen the studies that were done on people, And most, yeah, no, yeah, we could argue about the ethics of what was done in the UK and
I would just say the US as well too. The US, if you look at the CIA stuff, it's pretty insane. But Unit 731 is probably the worst example I can think of. That's Japan for you.
oh yeah, yeah. And the thing is, they didn't have access to the nerve agents, so there's not like a body of data there. Okay, yeah, nerve agents were out of their zone because they hadn't discovered them. Thank God for that too. I'd have to say. But as I say, you probably had some human experimentation in the Soviet Union on the nerve agents, so it's quite possible that they have a grasp of these a deeper grasp of the neuropsychiatric long term effects than anybody else does. I haven't said anything about it. That's quite possible. Couldn't prove it. That I would bet money on it though.
Do you think that like, do you think that's something that more people should be educated on? At least, I mean, like, you wrote a book about it, so you probably have a whole wealth of knowledge when it comes to these aspects of things, and you probably see things in media where it could be like that 2018 incident, where probably something that goes behind it a little more than the general public does.
Well, also, I see it the other way around sometimes. I see this sort of weird voyeurism at times where some people almost want there to be a chemical warfare attack, and it's really kind of weird. I
What?
mean, well, and maybe they're, I'm, as you know, I'm quite prolific on Twitter. Okay, uh, you
You got
know,
to be careful with that. Careful with that.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, yeah. Twitter's caused me a lot of problems over the years, but it's also made me famous. So it's a greasy pole I've climbed on Twitter to become the king of nerve agent Twitter. But I've also done a lot of good on there. I've raised a lot of money for charity and stuff. So hey, But so the point I was going to make is somebody sees a cloud, a explosion. Yeah.
Chemtrails.
Oh well, no explosion on the battlefield
Oh.
in Ukraine, for example. So, Dan, tell us what kind of chemical attack this is. Uh, I don't think it's a chemical attack. Look, it's a big orange cloud. All the media accounts say, yeah, uh, fertilizer warehouse struck by artillery. Okay. All of your nitrates, your potassium nitrate, your ammonium nitrate, all this stuff that's fertilizer used in millions of tons around the world makes a nice bright orange smoke cloud when you burn it. Okay. And it's a big smoke cloud going straight up in the air in broad daylight. And that's nobody's chemical attack. That's a Hollywood chemical attack. That's not a real chemical attack. Real chemical attacks don't go straight up in the air in this big cloud because there's no people in the cloud. Okay. And it's like, guys, it's a smoke cloud. It's not a chemical attack. And people are like arguing with me. People argue with me like, oh, these captured Russians, they've got gas masks. That means the Russians are ready to attack the chemical weapons. That's imminent. Like, every American soldier since 1917 has carried a gas mask. Uh, let's not get carried away with this. You know, uh, you know,
Well, the part where we say conspiracy enters society, we got to look at the fact is how many movies have those people watched as well too. I mean, a lot of the games take place around Cold War. Some of the Call of Duties take place with a lot of these nerve agents and toxins.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And basically, the actual reality is squalid, mundane, and boring.
Yeah.
I'm not going to name his name because he would prefer not to be named, but he was actually hired to be a technical consultant on nerve agents for that great movie, The Rock, and basically fired after a month because the nerve agents were too boring, so they made some shit up.
I think nerve agents are interesting, but I think it
Yeah,
depends on what you're looking for on interesting. Like for me,
yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
interest is the psychological effects.
Yeah, they're not visibly exciting. This is why some of these people get really, really worked up about fuel air explosives and hyperbaric stuff, thermobaric weapons, because they make a good, big, flashy, you know, good made for Hollywood fireball. Okay, they're actually rather overrated as battlefield weapons, but they make a good, flashy impact. Uh, Chemical weapons don't make for good Hollywood if you actually literally look at how they really were. You know, um, you know. So Hollywood has since, when it decides it needs a chemical weapon, it just basically makes one up out of its own mind for its entertainment purposes, rather than using the reality, because the reality is visually boring.
Well, what do you find? What do you, if we say visually boring, but what, for instance, what is your particular interest in it? Like when it comes down, it doesn't have to be where you focus, but what do you find? Like I find the psychological aspects fascinating, mostly because I care about that type of stuff. Like I like, I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think okay.
I'm not saying I'm scared of it or worried about it. I'm just saying it's interesting to me.
Yeah, but I think you and I are probably a minority in this stuff. Most people don't think about this stuff. Okay. I've been accused of being a real buzz killer at parties until I start talking about other things. Uh, Dan, he's that chemical weirdo, but I have many more depths than that. So I am a man for all seasons. But the act, rather, a lot of stuff is boring to normal people. This stuff, okay. Um, And not only that, you have a huge amount of people who have been through military service, and they mostly associate with wearing a hot, bulky suit and a gas mask, and they didn't like it. So it's associated with, so the people who have been through the military mostly associate this stuff with abject physical discomfort that they could do without it because, they were already doing physically discomforting stuff in the military. So to add that layer on it for an extra day or two in training just really annoyed the hell out of them. Okay. And most people weren't like me. I was in the Army Chemical Corps. I spent months in that stuff instead of hours. You get used to it. You can get used to anything. I got used to that more than I could get used to running 3 or 4 miles before breakfast. You know, um,
Well, I would say my particular interest lands around the area when I started looking into Agent Orange and what a lot of people would be like, oh, what's spraying those horrible chemicals and thing. I was like, not just that, but like the people that experienced it the worst were the people that were guarding the drum barrels and the tents where it was stored. And that to me is fascinating.
well, yeah, yeah, yeah. And so what you get? I mean, so when I studying the history of nerve agents, which is a subset of the history of chemical weapons, so you get to interesting things. This is where it intersects with an Agent Orange story, is that there's a whole cohort of the U.S. Army Chemical Corps, guys who would normally be alive now and still in their 80s and 90s, maybe, that I could talk to about the nerve agent stuff in the 60s uh, or in the 50s, even. And they're mostly gone. They're dead because you know what? Because they served in the Army Chemical Corps, and the Army Chemical Corps handled all the logistics and the dirty work of the Agent Orange program. So these guys all went to Vietnam to do that stuff. Okay, and that bit of historiography is gone. I don't have those guys to talk to. If I want to talk to pilots who bomb things, I can go find pilots. If I want to find a guy that drove a tank in the Vietnam War, if I want to find a Green Beret who raised a guerrilla army in Laos, I can find those people and talk to them still. I can't talk to these old Army Chemical Corps people because they're pretty much all gone.
That's fascinating to me, though. I don't know. I don't know why. I know people will be like, how is that interesting? I'm like, because if you think about working with something and you're not realizing that you're being exposed to something as well, too, it's like taking a bunch of x-rays. Like I always worry about like when people are in those x-ray rooms all the time. I get it's minimized to a point, but I'm like, damn it, like being in an MRI is not good for an extended period of time.
Okay. Um, you're not going to find, if you're doing some oral history, you're not going to find anybody to talk to who was a shoe salesman from the 1950s.
Oh, the shoe polish. Holy shit.
No,
What?
no, those X-ray machines that they used to have in the shoe shops. Yeah.
I didn't know they had x-ray machines in there.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. If you ever where are you based?
I'm in Maryland.
Okay, if you're ever in Minneapolis, you got to go to the Museum of Questionable Medical Devices.
What the hell did they use an X with the like X-ray somebody's foot?
Yeah, it was a little fluoroscope to X-ray your foot inside the shoe to see if the shoe is fitting. It was common in the 40s and 50s, and banned eventually because I mean, so there's a whole and also there's a whole generation of dentists that lost their fingers because they would literally hold the film in like
Oh shit, yeah, I know about that.
yeah, yeah, similar thing. So the hell of these shoe salesmen, X-ray machines are deadly as fuck. That's a technical term. Okay, all right, and a lot of those guys, they seemingly, guess what? They all died from things like leukemia in the 60s.
Oh my, see
I'm
that
not. I don't mean to laugh. That's a sick,
I know.
sardonic laugh. Not a. Yeah. So Agent Orange is like that. You know. I would have loved to talk to some of these guys, and if I'd been as interested in this in say the 1980s, these guys would have been around to talk to, but rather a lot of them are gone.
How difficult was that for you to try and write something about this? I mean, a lot of books I read now, especially from historical standpoints, people go like, "I got an exclusive interview with this. I got an exclusive interview with this." And it's like, I mean, a lot of your information, a lot of your historical perspective, they're not here anymore to be able
Yeah,
to speak about that.
well, I tell you what, the great gold mine was. My great gold mine was two things. One was talking to Michael Yandell, that American guy who got exposed to the sarin. He was a gold mine. I really hope he writes his own book about his experiences, because not only that, he's a top shelf guy. The thing is, because I was trying to fit a lot of history in 300 pages. I can only give him 5 or 6 pages really worth of stuff in there, and it's not doing his story any justice really. But also, yeah, having talked to him since, he wants to put it behind him. He's got a whole new career, all that, so he doesn't want to be the sarin poster boy, and I get that. But the real gold mine I had was studying the origins in the Nazi era. The military nerve agents were discovered in Nazi Germany, and a lot of that stuff was rather mysterious. I made huge discoveries in archives of stuff that nobody's seen in years. Okay, old records, particularly like captured stuff from Nazi Germany, that have been just basically bundled up and shoved in a file. And I found this stuff. Uh, you know,
Give me an example. Give me an example. Come on.
okay, well, all right. The blueprints for the first sarin factory.
Okay, you gotta explain a little bit more. Like, I really don't know the full extent of sarin.
Well, it's not easy to make. Okay,
Okay.
all right. Okay. So,
Did they ever manufacture or get a factory going, or was it just blueprints?
well, they had two factories. They had a fact. The first mass-produced military nerve agent was this other stuff called taboo, um, a lesser effective but still highly effective, nerve agent. Um, and they had a factory up and running for that, and eventually got full production, and that made something like 12,600 tons of the stuff during the Second World War. Didn't use it. Okay, stocked it away in depots, and they were trying to make a sarin factory, uh, to mass produce sarin, which sarin is probably approximately 5 to 7 times more deadly by weight than taboo. Evaporates more quickly, so it makes a more quick vapor hazard. Um, but it's also devilishly difficult to make. And so they had built this factory and were messing around with different processes. They never got to mass production. They never got to factory scale production, is what I'm trying to say. But I found all the records, I mean, including management meetings and incorporation documents for shell companies to hide the supply chain. Uh, the irony is, I think I could have proven that these guys were guilty even in Nazi Germany at the time of tax evasion, because rather a lot of this nerve agent program was a get rich scheme, because I found all the money trail. And the thing is, I mean, my German is limited. My wife reads and speaks German, but it got to the point where she says, "You give me any more Nazi shit to read, I'm leaving you." Okay, fair enough. It would be yeah, fine, fine. So I basically wore out every German speaker I know is willing to look at a couple old Nazi documents. But what I tell you, I can do, and I can look through charts and tables and numbers and spreadsheets and architectural diagrams and say, holy shit, this is the business. And I found approximately 19,000 pages of that stuff.
Well, do you find it interesting that the fact of like the fuel of war, of maybe this being an upper hand on your enemy, could actually get somebody rich, and some people notice that and they were like, we can just ask for more and they'll keep supplying us because they think we're going to produce something.
Yeah. Okay. And I make the controversial claim, and I don't. I'm
That's
not.
controversial.
No, no. I make a controversial claim in my book that first and foremost, the Nazi nerve agent program was a cunning wheeze to make money for a couple of people.
Sounds like it.
Yeah. There was this one guy in particular, Otto Ambros. He's literally the A in sarin. He didn't invent shit. He was the industrialist. He basically sold the concept of nerve agents to the Nazi government and got the fat contracts. Okay, and then basically oversold the idea, uh, and then couldn't quite deliver on it. and kept asking for more and more and more money. So there's this sunk cost fallacy. I just need a little bit more. Yeah, I know we were supposed to be in full production last year, but we had this problem, this problem, this problem. Yeah. Give me more money.
Did he flee the country afterwards? Because I would be running.
Oh well, no, he laid low. There's a whole detective. You got to read my book. You got to read my book. I don't want to steal my own thunder in here. There's a whole detective story, a cat and mouse game going on at the end of the war, and he was eventually found in his stash of documents, which were in a paint barrel buried in the forest.
What the fuck? I'm sorry. This you don't understand how like many articles I found where they're like, we found this in like a backyard ditch underground in a bunker, and it's just like, what the hell?
Yeah. So this Otto Ambrose, he was clever enough to have 19 jobs during the war simultaneously, all with full salary, and get a big cash award from Hitler himself.
How many baby mamas did he have?
I found his dry cleaning receipts. He was very well dressed.
That's
I
great.
literally found it because, I mean, there was a manhunt for this guy after the war. Okay. And so, for example, they went into the house and basically the contents of his desk were all seized up as evidence. And, there it is, his dry cleaning receipts and, his Christmas card to his mother, stuff like that. So I found all that crap. But, he knew that the end was coming. So he went down to the corporate headquarters. He worked for IG Farben, the German chemical company. That was one of his 19 jobs. He gave himself a lot of these fake jobs and fake salaries, he went down to the corporate headquarters. Well, actually, no, to be honest, he sent his deputy, this guy named Von Klenk, down to the corporate headquarters. He cleaned out basically all the paper trail documents, all the administrative stuff, the budget meetings, the contracts, the tax agreements, the dodgy movements of money, about 19,000 pages of this shit, blueprints, all this stuff, and corporation documents for their shell companies, all this stuff. And he wanted to eventually use this as a bargaining chip. And so he shoved it all in his paint barrel. This Von Klenk guy, Von Klenk didn't want to know where it was. So he got the guy who was the head of the fire department for this chemical factory complex, the firefighter, the fire chief, who was a pensioned off wounded war veteran from the SS on the East Front, so go hide this in the woods and don't tell me where it is. Okay. So he goes, digs in the woods, hides his paint barrel. And eventually, the smartest man I've never met, this guy named Edmund Tilley, who was this British intelligence officer, the guy trying to piece together the German chemical warfare program. More importantly, because he was the great interrogator, because he spoke fluent German. Anyway, Edmund Tilley, Major Tilley, does all this detective work, traces all, eventually finds the fire chief, basically says, well, you were in the SS, I'm just going to have you sent to the Russians who'll hang you if you're lucky after pulling all your, or you could tell me where you buried this shit. So he took him out basically in the woods with a shovel until he found it.
I am fascinated and I'm pissed off at the same time. Mostly I'm pissed because someone's smarter than me in that aspect. I hear half of these crazy stories about like somebody like what you just explained, and I start going, Jesus, I would never think of that. Like if you have 19 jobs, he necessarily didn't have 19 jobs. You're just covering his ass for all the money that he was taking out of the thing, like a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah. So anyway, so make a long story short, these 19,000 pages are now wrapped up in boxes and files at the UK National Archives here in Southwest London. The paint barrel itself is in the Imperial War Museum. I've been to visit it. I know the curator looks after it. So, and honestly, because this stuff was just, first it was literally buried, then it was figuratively buried in the archives, and it was wrapped up, and you could tell these old sort of silk ribbons on it were crusty. I was the first guy to look at these in a long time, and I sat there for days cackling manically to myself, photographing something like, I'm not sure I can account for everything that was in the barrel because I don't have an inventory of what went into the barrel, but I found an awful lot of stuff that was in the barrel. Anyway.
And you use a lot of that for your book as well, too.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I if I really wanted to, and I had access to, say, German-speaking forensic accountant, 3 or 4, translators, I could write the world's most boring 19,000-page volume history of this shit. And it'd be fascinating. It'd be my life's work, and sell 4 copies, and I'd go broke.
You said boring and fascinating in the same sentence, but
Fascinating.
I would read the hell out of it.
Yeah, yeah, you'd be one of the 4 guys to buy it. That's the problem. You see, I gotta see. The thing is, I'm now in the having written books that don't sell, very much. I wrote a very thick, dense textbook. Now I write I've got deals with publishers now to write books that do sell. So I do things like get advances for books now, which means I sort of have to earn those advances.
um, Look, I'm gonna have to definitely read your book. Is there a place where people can find your book? Is there a place where people can find your Twitter? Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Okay, I will for the purposes of this, I will spell out my last name: Kaszeta. First name is Dan. The book we must have been talking about is called Toxic: A History of Nerve Agents from Nazi Germany to Putin's Russia. It's available in the U.S. Barnes and Nobles or on Amazon, or available directly through Oxford University Press. Um, I'm also tell you, hey, it's in some libraries. Get a library to order. Library sales are actually very important to me, and I don't make a huge amount of money off of an individual book sale, so I don't feel bad if somebody goes and reads my book, in a library. Also, it's on Audible, it's on Kindle, it's easily found around the world.
I'm gonna listen to it on Audible. I don't think I can read.
Yeah. Okay. And and I've got a lot of feedback, nearly all good. It's a rarity to get a book reviewed in both the London Review of Books and Nature, which is basically the world's oldest and most prestigious scientific journal. So don't be put off. It's not a science book. It's a history book with science. It's not a science book with history. Um, and I've got eventually, maybe next year, I'm going to have a book on tear gas and riot control agents, defense sprays coming out, because I've got interesting things to say in that world too.
Oh yeah. I'm gonna link all your links in the description, man. Seriously, I'm gonna definitely download it on Audible. I like to listen to books now. It's just I have ADHD. It's hard for me to sit and flip through pages. I end up wanting to get up, and the next thing I know, I'll be standing on top of my car with a book, just reading because no, I don't know how I got there, but I'm gonna link all your links in the description. Dan, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.